Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Welcome to our daily Hindu analysis. As promised, we shall be launching our Target Prelims 2022 crash course from today, and this program will be exclusively available on the BYJU'S Exam Prep app. This program, which will run until the 24th of May, will focus on all the important static subjects for your prelims. And by downloading the app, you will be able to access mock tests, followed by a live discussion by our faculties at 2:30 p.m. the next day. Along with this, from the 30th of April, we shall be starting our YouTube crash course as well, which will specifically focus on current affairs from different subjects. And this crash course will be aligned with the crash course that runs on the app. So if you're aspiring to clear this year's prelims, then we are offering you a one-stop solution on the BYJU'S Exam Prep app, and all you have to do is download the app and sign up for the course. So with this, let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by taking up a column from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. This column examines the role of mediation in bringing international conflicts to an end and evaluates whether India is in a position to mediate between Russia, Ukraine, and the Western countries to bring the conflict in Eastern Europe to a peaceful resolution. See, with regard to the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has not only violated international law, but it has also violated a key security assurance that Russia had given to Ukraine under the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. The Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances was signed in the year 1994 after the Soviet Union disintegrated, and it was signed at the OSCE conference held at Budapest in Hungary. This agreement of 1994 was signed between the leaders of United States, United Kingdom, Russia, and Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. These were the signatories to the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances, and under this agreement, the nuclear powers, that is US, UK, Russia, and to an extent even France and China, they promised not to use military force or economic coercion against Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, except for in self-defense or in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. These nuclear powers made this commitment because Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine, they were all part of the former Soviet Union, which itself was a nuclear power. So to convince Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine to give up their nuclear weapons and to ensure that they sign on to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the nuclear weapon states such as Russia, US, and UK promised and guaranteed that they're not going to go to war with Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine, and they gave these security assurances through the Budapest Memorandum. As a result of these agreements and the Budapest Memorandum, between 93 and 96, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine, they gave up their nuclear arsenal. So now, with Russia invading Ukraine, Russia has violated these commitments because Russia was neither acting in self-defense nor according to the UN Charter. In this ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, gross violations have already been reported, and thousands of civilians and soldiers have already lost their lives on both the sides, and especially Ukraine has been at the receiving end of Russia's human rights violations. So as there is no end in sight to this conflict, the writers of the column are suggesting employing the mediation process through a neutral third-party mediator who could help resolve the differences not just between Russia and Ukraine and bring the conflict to an end, but also to mediate the covert conflict between Russia and the Western countries. Because even though the Western countries haven't directly entered the conflict, they have been extending covert support to Ukraine to fight back against the Russian invasion, and they have targeted Russia with economic sanctions, which has made achieving conflict resolution impossible, thus leading to the dragging of the conflict in Eastern Europe. Even though few attempts were made to achieve peace through the mediation of Turkey, these peace talks have failed and they haven't made much progress. And in the absence of a ceasefire, Russian military assaults have continued against Ukraine, particularly in the eastern region, where Russia has not only backed the separatist rebels in the Donbas region, but has also recognized the Donetsk and Luhansk regions as independent. This continued conflict in Ukraine has led to thousands of civilian casualties, and more than 4 million Ukrainians have been driven out of the country seeking refuge in neighboring countries. The Western countries, on the other hand, have tried punishing Russia through economic sanctions, and these financial and economic measures of the European Union and the G7 members has hit the Russian economy pretty hard. The conflict and the Western sanctions is taking its toll on the Russian economy as well, which has been struggling to prop up its currency, the ruble, and has been struggling to manage the high inflation levels at a time when Russia's forex reserves have been frozen by the Western countries, and Russia is being pushed towards economic isolation as it can no longer access funding and loans through multilateral institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF. So the war in Ukraine and the sanctions against Russia has crippled the global economy as global supply chains have been disrupted, thus leading to significant surge in fuel and food prices around the world. So given these circumstances, there was never a better time to focus on conflict resolution in order to achieve a peaceful and immediate end to the conflict, and hence the writers emphasize the role of mediation, especially by a neutral third country. See, to resolve any international conflict, first it is important to bring out the position and the actual interests of the parties that are involved in the conflict. Every party which goes to war will have a stated position that justifies their actions, and these positions that they maintain is a result of their hidden interests, which they are seeking to fulfill through the use of force. So if you have to resolve such a conflict, the talks should not just focus on the position that the parties are taking, but should try and identify and bring out the actual interests of the parties which is driving them to take this position. See, all the previous negotiations that took place between Russia and Ukraine, they failed to achieve much progress because Russia and Ukraine and other countries, they were focusing only on the positions of the different parties rather than on their actual interests. Now, this is where the role of mediation comes in. Because see, the position that a party is taking is just the surface statement or the public statement that the party is trying to send out in the conflict. For example, Russia's position for going to war against Ukraine is that the separatist areas in eastern Ukraine will have to be liberated and Ukraine will have to be disarmed and denazified as it is posing a threat to Russia's security. While this is the position that Russia has taken to justify its war against Ukraine, its real interest lies in the fact that Russia has been trying to protect its traditional sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, which was being threatened and eaten away by the Western countries led by NATO, by using Ukraine and other countries in the region as a proxy against Russia. So it is this interest which represents the true intentions of Russia, and this has made Russia to take this position publicly to go to war against Ukraine. Similarly, the other party involved in the conflict will also have its public position and the genuine interests which are pushing its position. So through a process of neutral mediation, the actual position and interests can be brought out and distinguished, which will facilitate both the parties involved in the war to identify their actual hidden interests and motives, which will further lay the ground towards a peaceful resolution for the conflict. So in the context of international relations and geopolitics, mediation refers to assisted negotiation, which is an attempt to resolve the conflict through this flexible tool, which is often facilitated by a neutral third party. Depending on the third party involved, mediation can either facilitate the two conflicting parties to reach a middle ground or help the conflicting parties to evaluate their positions and actual interests by holding joint negotiations or through back-channel diplomacy or by communicating with each other through the mediator. Then even with regard to international jurisprudence, the process of mediation makes more sense for conflict resolution because mediation is based on collaborative bargaining, where the objective is to work out a compromise or reach the middle ground that can produce a win-win situation for all the parties involved in the conflict. Whereas other legal options, such as arbitration or litigation, they lead to the continuation of hostilities as it is based on a zero-sum approach, under which a loss for one party is seen as a win for the other. So such a resolution arrangement leads to the continuation of hostile relations, and arrangements such as arbitration or litigation is not equipped to deal with international conflicts. Whereas mediation, on the other hand, provides a flexible tool for all the parties, where one neutral third party mediator can help the two conflicting parties to reach a middle ground while protecting their respective core interests. That's the reason why mediation is seen as the best solution to resolve an international conflict, and hence it has also been recognized under Article 33 of the UN Charter. In fact, throughout history, there are many examples of successful mediation which has brought conflicts to an end. There have been individual leaders, countries, and even organizations which have taken part in neutral mediation. And for example, the International Committee of the Red Cross has mediated as per its mandate under the Geneva Conventions and has often acted as a neutral third party to broker peace between the conflicting nations. So theorists in political science believe that mediation is a form of power brokerage where one neutral third power is leveraging its influence with both the parties to broker a deal, thus essentially making it a political problem-solving process. A popular and successful example of mediation is the signing of the Camp David Accords of 1978 between Israel and Egypt, which was mediated by the United States, and the then US President Jimmy Carter has been credited for his role in working out a mediated dispute settlement between these two hostile countries. And since the Camp David Accords were signed in 1978, peace has prevailed between Israel and Egypt for more than 4 decades. In fact, there is a much larger scientific and psychological basis that justifies mediation through a third party as the best possible way of resolving conflicts. Because studies in neuroscience have shown that emotions, when they run high, they cloud our logical thinking and prevents the actors from behaving in a rational way. The same holds good for two countries and governments as well. When emotions are high during a war, the conflicting parties are unlikely to listen to each other or look at each other's position. High emotions pushes them to act without logic or rational, thus leads them to take a reactive approach against the other country. So this is where a neutral third-party mediator can play an important role to tone down the emotions by acting as the go-between, and the neutral third-party mediator can engage in shuttle diplomacy, where the mediator will shuttle between the conflicting parties to convey each other's position without the emotions and help the other party realize the true hidden interests of the other side which led to the conflict in the first place. So as mediation is a proven process for conflict resolution, the writers of the column are suggesting that India is in the right position to mediate between Russia, Ukraine, and the Western countries to restore peace and stability in Eastern Europe. Because today, India has not only emerged as a major economic and military power, but it has also emerged as a major geopolitical player in the Indo-Pacific and beyond the Indo-Pacific. And India's standing at the global level has been further amplified, given that it is a non-permanent member as of now at the UN Security Council. This is what explains the attempts of all the parties to approach India in an attempt to convince India to extend support for their respective interests. That's the reason why, after the Russia-Ukraine conflict broke out, top officials and diplomats from US, UK, and other countries have been visiting India to convince India that it should act against Russia and criticize Russia's violations. And they are hoping to convince India to vote against Russia at the UN. On the other hand, the Ukrainian government has made a similar appeal for protecting its interests, and even Russia has sent its top officials, including its foreign minister, to the country to ensure that India remains aligned with Russia. So essentially, all the parties involved in the conflict have been seen to be courting India as they consider India to be a significant player, and this, according to the writers, is a great opportunity for India to establish itself as a responsible global power, which can play a major role in mediating international conflicts. On one hand, India enjoys strategic and trusted relations with Russia, which have been time tested since the days of the Cold War. Also, considering the impact of economic sanctions, Russia is giving very high priority to its economic ties with India, as India can be a major buyer of Russian oil and gas, along with potentially helping Russia to bypass the Western economic sanctions. The US and the Western countries, on the other hand, also look at India as a key partner, and despite India's position at the UN, which largely seems to be favoring Russia indirectly, they know that they can't afford to target India over its independent policy that it is pursuing with regard to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Because for US and the Western countries, India is a key strategic partner in the Indo-Pacific to counterbalance the aggressive rise of China, and this is what explains India's centrality in groupings such as the Quadrilateral. So in many ways, India has become a key partner for both Russia and the Western countries, and this is what gives India the leverage and the position against both the sides to bring them to the negotiating table and help each other understand the core interests of both the sides so that it can enable a peaceful settlement to the conflict in Ukraine by utilizing its role as a neutral third-party mediator. The writers hope that India should be able to handle this position as it seeks to emerge as the Vishwa Guru or the world leader, and this conflict in Ukraine provides the right opportunity for India to establish its credentials as a major global power, which will not only help India in playing a positive role in ending the conflict and in cementing its relations with both Russia and the Western countries, but it will also help India to counterbalance the influence and pressure of China, which has emerged as a key ally of Russia and a primary rival to the West. Now let's take a look at a column from page number 6 that examines the plight of migrant workers in India and the policy measures that need to be taken to improve their conditions. See, ever since India introduced the LPG reforms, or liberalization, privatization, globalization reforms in early 1990s, India has witnessed massive urbanized economic growth, which led to large-scale human migration from rural to urban areas, thus creating a new social challenge. As farmers were struggling in rural areas to secure their livelihood through agriculture, the new and exciting opportunities that opened up in the urban areas triggered a large-scale migration of people from the rural towards urban areas. According to estimates, more than 300 million Indians have moved out of rural areas towards urban centers, and they not only shifted from rural farm work to informal labor and jobs in urban areas, but they were also lifted out of poverty due to significant improvement in their livelihood standards. But however, majority of the migrant workers, they were employed in the informal sector, and hence they've always struggled to achieve livelihood security and social security. This ended up breeding a new kind of inequality in the urban areas, and the urban poor primarily constituted migrant workers who were facing multiple socio-economic challenges. On one hand, migrant workers who constituted the urban poor suffered from cultural and social disconnect owing to their migration, along with struggling to make ends meet as there was no income guarantee or livelihood guarantee, followed by lack of social security and nutritional and educational security. Ever since, India's urban informal working population has been a vulnerable section, and their vulnerability was on complete display following the breakout of the COVID-19 pandemic. As the country went into a lockdown in 2020, we all witnessed disturbing images from Indian cities, where millions of migrant workers lost their jobs and livelihood, and they were forced to migrate back to their villages, at great risk to their personal well-being in many cases. This grave migrant crisis, seen in 2020, prompted the government and the civil society to come out with immediate relief measures to provide basic assistance and support to one of the most neglected classes. This led the Government of India to introduce several schemes and policies, such as the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana, to ensure their nutritional security and food security, along with implementing the One Nation, One Ration card to provide a universal food security net for migrant workers. the government also came out with the affordable rental housing complexes to provide adequate shelter to the migrant workers, along with launching the e-Shram portal for unorganized workers in the informal sector, and even started working on a draft migration policy to address the concerns and plight of migrant workers in order to address their economic and social concerns and to guarantee their protection and overall well being. This sudden national awakening towards the plight of migrant workers was hoped to become a turning point which would push the national discourse towards the plight of migrant workers, which was hoped to result in legal and policy changes that could alleviate the conditions of migrant workers. But unfortunately, despite this hope, the distress of migrant workers has continued even after they received national attention from the media and the government. The pandemic has uprooted their lives and livelihoods, and several reports point towards the continuing distress being faced by migrant workers with regard to low wages, lack of adequate nutrition, healthcare, and inadequate shelter and education, which is directly compromising their socio-economic well-being. For this continued crisis and distress, the writers hold the scattered response of the government to be responsible because subsequent governments have never paid enough attention, that is, policy attention, towards the conditions and problems faced by migrant workers. Even though we have enough policies in place, they all seem to be disconnected, and the lack of strategic thinking and strategic policy guidance from the government has led to a fragmented approach towards ensuring the well being of migrant workers. Upon this, the migrant crisis has been highly politicized, especially at the state level, because in destination states that receive the migrant workers, migrants are simply treated as outsiders, and regional political parties use the issue to promote nativism in the hope of winning elections. In these states, political parties target the outsiders to turn the natives into their vote bank. On the other hand, in the sending states, from where majority of the migrant workers come from, there the migrant workers themselves are treated as a vote bank by the political parties, and it leads to the unnecessary politicization of the concerns and issues that are affecting the migrant workers. Then upon this, the broad neglect of rural development, both at the state level and the national level, has contributed to the continuation of the migrant crisis. And along with this, the administrative and bureaucratic challenge in accurately identifying and targeting the migrants has eroded the efficiency of existing schemes and programs. Then, both at the state and central level, there seems to be a lack of reliable data on the pattern of movement of migrant workers within the country, and also with regard to their key socio-economic indicators. Few states have tried coming out with a better response to deal with the migrant workers and their crisis. And in states like Maharashtra and Chhattisgarh, attempts have been made to implement a migration tracking system through which migrant workers can not only be registered, but they can also be tracked and reached by the respective states to address their concerns and grievances. But these policy efforts have been limited to few states and to few departments, and hence there is an urgent need for strategic policy guidance from the central government to ensure that a strategic convergence is brought about amongst the states by focusing on interstate coordination, especially between destination and sending states, and by focusing on interdepartmental coordination within the state governments and the central government. So instead of wasting precious government resources through scattered policies and implementation, the writers are calling for a strategic national level approach led by the center and the Niti Aayog, which can fine-tune the migration policy in order to achieve the required coordination between the state governments and government departments. Next, we have an article on page number 8 that examines what is the AFSPA or the Armed Forces Special Powers Act and the reasons behind its recent partial rollback in some of the northeastern states. See, AFSPA is a British-era law which has been highly controversial that has been implemented in the conflict-hit zones of India. To the Armed Forces Special Powers Ordinance of 1942, which was brought out by the British colonial government to suppress and target the Quit India movement which had broken out. Later, following independence, when the country was partitioned, and when this led to riots and communal violence, to deal with these internal security challenges, AFSPA was brought back, where it was invoked in only few disturbed areas, such as Assam and Bengal, to contain the internal security threats that had emerged. But post-independence, the first place where AFSPA was enacted and enforced was in the Naga Hills region, where the Naga insurgency had already broken out, which back then was still a part of the larger state of Assam. So, to contain the Naga insurgency threat, Assam was declared as a disturbed area under the Assam Disturbed Areas Act of 1955, following which the Armed Forces Assam and Manipur Special Powers Act of 1958 was enforced. This law gave tremendous power to the security forces that included the Indian Army, the state police, and the paramilitary forces to counter and contain the internal security threat that had been created by the Naga insurgency. Later, as insurgencies broke out in Manipur and Mizoram in 1960s, and when insurgencies broke out in Assam and Tripura as well in 1970s, AFSPA was extended to cover these northeastern states as well, with the primary objective of countering insurgency in the region. Then later in 1983, when Khalistan movement had broken out in Punjab, to contain the terrorist threat and the separatist threat, AFSPA was introduced in Punjab as well. And after Kashmir insurgency and terrorism broke out in 1987, AFSPA was introduced in Jammu and Kashmir as well in 1990. So throughout AFSPA's history, the government and the security forces have maintained that a law such as AFSPA is absolutely essential in the conflict zones, not just to protect the security forces by granting them immunity for their actions, but also for enabling effective security operations against the insurgents and terrorists. But this colonial era law has become very controversial in India's conflict zones, and the law has been strongly criticized by human rights activists, by various government and court appointed commissions, and as well as by the Supreme Court. The AFSPA has even been labeled as a draconian law, and several legal experts have pointed out that a law like AFSPA has no place in a constitutional democracy, as it enables gross human right violations in the conflict zones. See, under Section 3 of the law, the governor of a state has been empowered, along with the administrator of a union territory, to declare any area as a disturbed area under the Disturbed Areas Act. This is done by issuing an official notification in the Gazette of India, which in turn gives the central government the authority to deploy armed forces to aid and assist the civil administration, which alone is not capable of dealing with the security threats. Here, the central government and the governor have a discretion to declare an area as a disturbed area if they perceive a threat to public peace and tranquility due to differences, disputes, and conflicts between members of different communities belonging to different religions, different races, different languages, and different regional groups or castes. Generally, the presence of insurgency and terrorism, which is often aided with external help from other countries, has been a ground for declaring conflicted areas as disturbed areas, which lays the ground for imposing AFSPA in these regions. The law has been controversial because it allegedly gives a license to kill for the security forces, as it authorizes the armed forces, the police, and paramilitary forces to kill anyone they suspect to be acting in contravention of the law in these disturbed areas. The forces are also given the right to arrest, search property, and even destroy property if required without a warrant. And for all these actions, the security forces are given complete immunity from any legal action and prosecution. Essentially, for these acts, security forces won't be held liable or accountable, and this is seen as a necessary protection that should be given to security forces, which operate under extremely challenging circumstances in the conflict-hit areas. But these powers to kill, and as well as to violate fundamental rights, without any adequate checks and balances, has often led to strong allegations that provisions of AFSPA has been misused by the security forces to grossly violate human rights in the conflict-hit areas. But following severe criticism regarding the misuse of the law, various committees were set up which gave their recommendations, including the BP Jeevan Reddy Commission and as well as the Santosh Hegde Committee and the Justice J.S. Verma Committee. Most of these committees have concluded that AFSPA has been misused in the conflict-hit areas, and some of them have even referred to the law as a draconian law, which is completely unconstitutional. Following such strong criticism and allegations, a periodic review feature was introduced for continuing AFSPA in the conflict-hit areas. And in this regard, the government of Assam and Manipur issue a notification every 6 months approving the extension of AFSPA, whereas the Ministry of Home Affairs of the Union government issues the notification for Nagaland and Arunachal Pradesh and few other applicable areas in the northeast to extend AFSPA for another 6 months following the periodic review. In the light of this controversy, just a few years back, Tripura became the first state to completely remove AFSPA, as the state had been completely stabilized after insurgency was brought to an end in Tripura back in 1990s itself. Every now and then, incidents kept occurring in AFSPA areas in the northeast, including the recent accidental killings of civilians in Nagaland by the Indian Army, which led to renewed calls in the northeast for the complete removal of AFSPA. The same controversy has been seen in Jammu and Kashmir as well, where AFSPA continues to be in place, and in Punjab, it took many years for the government to completely lift AFSPA provisions even after the Khalistan movement had been defeated. So in the context of these controversies and demands, recently on the 31st of March, the Union Home Ministry announced that the disturbed areas have been reduced under AFSPA provisions in Assam, Manipur and Nagaland. This will take effect from 1st of April itself. And these decisions of the centre along with the state governments was based on the recommendations of a committee that was constituted by the Home Ministry last year. Now let us look at a few small articles that provide us important updates for both prelims and mains. According to this article on page number 10, the Attorney General has informed the Supreme Court that there is no need for a separate law to enforce fundamental duties on citizens. As you know, Article 51A of the Constitution provides for a set of fundamental duties. But these fundamental duties are merely prescriptory in nature, and they cannot be enforced and they are not justiciable. Then coming to the last article on page number 13, according to the World Health Organization, 99% of the global population is breathing polluted air. The WHO report holds pollution to be directly responsible for millions of deaths every year. And out of the 6,000 cities which were studied, 99% of the population in them were exposed to highly polluted air. The pollution standards in most of these cities were way above the WHO standards. And satellite data has shown that the worst air quality was found in Eastern Mediterranean, Southeast Asian regions, which include South Asia as well, along with Africa. So clearly, the problem of air pollution is aggravated in developing nations as compared to the developed world. Now let's take a look at the mains practice questions. The first question: evaluate the role of mediation in establishing peace during international conflicts. Can India play a role in ending the conflict in Eastern Europe by mediating between Russia, Ukraine, and the Western countries? The second question: there has been a collective failure in addressing the plight of migrant workers. Examine the policy measures that need to be taken to ameliorate their condition. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link has been given in the description box below. So with this, let's conclude our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.